We have a question from Torbeth, and I'm not too sure, Torbeth, what the question is. I'm sort of trying to figure it out, but she said she had a comment question from Monday's discussion. She said, an atheist I know commented on your question of why sexual sin outside of marriage, like incest, pedophilia, and bestiality is wrong. He said it's because our ancestors didn't know better, and we now know about germs, viruses, mutations, etc. How should we respond? So do you guys understand what the question is in that?
I understand the question. So in other words, he's trying to construct a morality that is not found in any scriptural text.
Right.
So he's saying that our ancestors utilized religious texts in order to understand their morality. So instead of just saying like, I think we shouldn't do this, they said, well, I believe that God is kind of telling me not to do this. But then later on, we started to figure out reasons as to why that was bad, like pedophilia, bestiality, as well as incest. So the problem with his argument is that it obviously doesn't get you very far. So when you say, well, what about germs and things like that? Well, now we actually have instruments that would allow you to have sex with an animal that you wouldn't get any germs or you wouldn't get any viruses. We have means by which an incestuous couple, right, a brother and a sister, a father and a daughter, could have sexual relations without procreating, which is what makes incest so negative, is that they procreate, and because their genetic material is so similar, it could propagate defects within their DNA. But you could say, okay, well, fine, that's wrong. Well, what's wrong with, say, a father and a daughter having sex if they don't have intention to bear children? What's wrong with pedophilia if the child is consenting? And Freud argued that children are sexual from birth, and therefore they are consenting to their sexual development. What's wrong with a 13-year-old consenting to have sex with a 30-year-old? What's wrong with that if they're both consenting to it? And again, the negative would be that you could maybe procreate on accident, things like that. Well, what if they prevented it, utilizing different materials to do so? Same with like, you could even push it really far and say, well, what's wrong with necrophilia? What's wrong with having sex with a dead body? So if you're going to just start with, I'm going to argue my morality simply by what makes sense, you're going to have to take your conclusions to their logical ends. And most atheists are unwilling to do that. One that is, and I appreciate him for it, is a guy named Peter Singer. Man, he's an ethics professor at Princeton, and man, he takes his conclusions to their logical ends, and it's frightening, right? When he talks about what these principles really mean. Another guy historically is Nietzsche, right? So Friedrich Nietzsche in Germany, when he was arguing about the concept of what he viewed as the death of God, he said, well, there is no morality. He named his book Beyond Good and Evil. Because he's like, there is no morality. If God isn't there, then everything is permissible. So why can't I do these things? All there is just the ability. If you have the ability to do it, then it becomes right for you. It's just what someone can do. Right. So, if you want to argue in that way, if you want to say there is no objective morality, all there is just what makes sense for me, fine. But just admit that. Just say this is where my morality comes from. It's just what makes sense to me. Great. There's an argument that a Christian could have towards someone like that about the importance of objective morality. From a societal perspective, I do try to encourage those who don't believe in God to understand what it really would mean for society if we threw out all religious connotations of our moral system. And again, I encourage people to read Friedrich Nietzsche. He's a little difficult to read, but please read him because he really walks you through it. What happens when God is dead? And by the way, he's kind of rejoicing that God is dead. He was an atheist, but he is telling his fellow atheists, you're running off the fumes of Christianity. We need to get rid of it. You guys say that we should love our neighbors. That's stupid. We need to be ubermenches. We need to be supermen. We need to just shape our own reality, and the will to power is all that matters, right? So that was his argument. So again, if you want to just say it's just what makes sense to me, again, there are societal implications to it. But usually when I'm talking to someone like that, I always come back to, look, I don't argue for Christianity because it is pragmatic. Meaning I don't argue for Christianity because it's better for society. I argue for Christianity because it's true, right? And you're right. If it's not true, then let's just pull from it what we can and then move on. But if it is true, then we have to take it seriously. But
Yeah, I think a lot of people make the argument that, hey, incest, started in the Bible, and then then you see it kind of dwindle away in the Torah through various laws. Specifically, if you read Leviticus 18, and you get into the Torah, the law of Moses, you get a very clear idea that incest is not a part of that. And some people do make that argument of like, hey, well, it's changed, so it must be a changing thing.
Right.
So the reason why we don't do it today is because things change over time. But really, we run into a problem with this, and that is because the law of Moses, the New Testament tells us, now we know that whatever the law says, this is Romans chapter 3, verse 19, says, whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may become guilty before God. So really what the law was doing is the law was just showing and restraining the evilness of people's hearts.
Yep.
So even though incest started all the way back, in the very beginning, it wasn't God's intention, so to speak, with its human malice and human anger and hate, to go this direction. Because when we think of incest, a lot of times, like, it's hard for us to picture like a pure incest, like a purity in it.
Right.
Like to be fruitful and multiply, and like a purity. Like if Adam and Eve did not eat of the fruit, hypothetically, they have children. That's the first commandment: be fruitful and multiply. And then, is their children going to have children? They would have intimacy with themselves. One man, one woman. That is the framework that's given in Genesis. Just one male, one female for life to bear children. So is that what would happen? Now the answer could be, well, yeah, that could be what happens, but it's not, there's no fall.
Right.
So there is a world that we just don't know.
Right.
But since the world is fallen, and we get into Cain and Abel and their stories and the different daughters that Eve and Adam had, and the heart of human beings was corrupt from that point on. So it's not like the incest was great. It's not like it was a purity at all.
Which again gets into a major distinction between the Christian who's arguing and the atheist who's arguing. So from the Christian perspective, we believe that man has a fallen nature.
Yeah.
And so therefore, instinctively, we don't naturally want to do the right thing. And that sexuality actually needs to have safeguards around it because it's easy for man to abuse sexuality to the detriment of others, to exercise sexual power over other people for my own benefit and pleasure. Does that happen historically?
Yes.
Yes, it does. Right.
So if you try to create the incest perfect, pure system, like so many weird cult leaders have tried to do,
right?
Right?
Absolutely.
It's still what you're talking about because there's something wrong with us.
But from an atheist perspective, they don't believe that man is inherently fallen.
Right.
And so it's much easier for them to think in these terms of, no, there were like these arbitrary moral commandments placed above us. And if we want to ascend, kind of again like a Nietzsche idea, if we want to ascend, we got to throw them off and we got to just determine for ourselves what's right versus what's wrong. Kind of rise to the taunt of Satan in the garden. You could be like gods, discerning both good and evil for yourself, right? So that's an interesting perspective. So once again, though, we're arguing on a platform, a foundation of saying we believe these things are true. That's why we're arguing this way. But that's from a societal point. If you want to, Torbeth, if you want to listen, last week we talked about Mere Christianity. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis actually talks about how you can use morality to argue for the existence of God, but it's not the way that most Christians argue for the existence of God using morality. So most modern Christians butcher his argument, and what they do is they say, if you're not Christian, you can't be moral. Of course you can be moral if you're not a Christian. Tons of people who are moral are moral who aren't Christians. The point of C.S. Lewis's argument for objective morality is we don't think of our morality as being arbitrary and societally created, right? When I get mad at someone for robbing me, I don't say, that seems wrong to me that you did that, right? We say that was wrong. You did something inappropriate, right? When the Nazis were on trial in Nuremberg, and their lawyers were arguing, saying, hey, this just seems wrong to you guys. The fact that we gassed a bunch of Jews. Like, it didn't seem wrong to us, and it's our country, and you invaded us. So who are you to tell us that we're wrong? And they answered back, and they said, yeah, but there's a law above the law. There's an objective standard for humanity that you are subjected to, and your laws are subjected to.
Yeah.
So that's something that we got to wrestle with. So, Torbeth, yeah, I encourage you, if you haven't read Mere Christianity, read it. Understand the moral argument. That could be a way you dialogue with your friend. But just try to get him to be honest with his position. Like if you're going to say, hey, I'm just developing my sexual morality from what I think is best, then just say that, right? But then who are you to forbid other people? Right. Who are you to tell me that I can't do that someone else can't do this thing that you find gross? Just let them do what they're going to do.
Right. Yeah. And I'll just say, once again, I'll reiterate that point that, the law, the Torah, the law of Moses, when these laws were put in, again, Romans chapter 3 says it so clearly that by the law is the knowledge of sin.
Right.
That's why they were put in. It was to show that from Adam to Moses, there wasn't an absence of sin. There was sin.
Right.
That's what it's trying to point out,
Yep.
through the Torah. And so sometimes people, again, argue like, oh, well, it started off like, this way, and then God instituted it, so it must change. So it must be a changing.
Well, I think he's more arguing from the fact that societies just shift.
Yeah, society's shifting.
Because he doesn't believe in God.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you could even make the argument like you could say, well, hey, the Jewish they switched. They switched from the time of Abraham to the time of Moses or something like that.
Right.
But the bottom line is the reason why the law is there is to condemn all as sinners.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the clear thing. From the Bible's perspective, anyway.
Yeah.
Well, and I like what Moses says when he gives the law. He says that he has given us this law that we might live in the land and prosper within it. So it's for our good. The argument of Christians is that the law simultaneously does two things. It simultaneously condemns us because we know this is the way that we ought to live, but we don't. So Paul's argument in Romans 1-3 is it's not just the fact that we read it in a book and we say, oh, like I wasn't supposed to do that. Oh, well, it's in my conscience, in my heart, I know I'm not supposed to do these things, but I do them anyway, right? That's what's condemning me. It's not simply the law of God. The law of God just expresses what my conscience is already telling me, which is that I am guilty. I'm doing things that are wrong, and therefore I am in need of forgiveness, and that is only given to us through the cross. But yeah.